He gave a performance that day that was totally unplayable.
England were world champions, Wembley was full, and Jim Baxter was laughing, not after the match, during it. With Scotland leading against the reigning world champions, Baxter began juggling the ball near the halfway line, keepie-uppies, at Wembley, against England. It was the sort of thing footballers were never supposed to do, not in a match like this, not against opponents like these, but Baxter did it anyway. The crowd could not believe it. England's players could not believe it, and some of the men watching would never completely forget it. Because this was never just about losing. England had lost matches before. Every great team does. What made this different was the humiliation. The feeling that Scotland's most gifted player was enjoying every second of it. Years later, that afternoon was still being discussed. Not because of the score, not because of the trophy, but because of Jim Baxter, a football genius whose greatest performance left some of the biggest names in football carrying a memory they never escaped. And it all began at Wembley. Subscribe because some football scars survive longer than the men who carry them. The men who crossed paths with Jim Baxter at Wembley did not lose to an ordinary footballer. They lost to one of Scotland's greatest talents, and perhaps its most unpredictable. By the time the famous afternoon arrived, Baxter was already a star. Rangers supporters adored him, opponents feared him, and Scotland saw him as the player capable of changing any match with a single pass. He was not built around speed or strength. His greatest weapon was his mind. Baxter saw spaces others missed. He controlled matches without appearing to work hard, and when pressure arrived, he seemed to enjoy it. That confidence made him special. It also created problems. Managers wanted discipline. Baxter preferred freedom. Football expected obedience. Baxter preferred doing things his own way. The bigger his reputation became, the less interested he seemed in following the rules. Yet nobody could argue with the results. League titles arrived, cup victories followed, Scotland built its team around him, and supporters began calling him a genius. But there was another side to Jim Baxter. Away from the applause, he was already developing habits that would later damage both his career and his life. The brilliance was real, so was the self-destruction. For now, however, none of that mattered, because in the spring of 1967, Jim Baxter stood at the peak of his powers, and England's world champions were about to find out exactly what that meant. Most football rivalries end when the match is over. This one did not. For Jim Baxter, Wembley became the greatest day of his life. For others, it became something they could never fully escape. The newspapers moved on, the supporters moved on, football moved on. Yet the names connected to that afternoon remained tied together for decades. Whenever Jim Baxter's name appeared, so did the memory. Whenever his greatest matches were discussed, that day returned. The victory became part of his legend. The humiliation became part of theirs. And that is what made the story so painful. Because footballers can accept being beaten by a better team. What they struggle to accept is becoming part of somebody else's masterpiece. Jim Baxter's masterpiece happened at their expense. Years later, one famous football figure was still being linked to that afternoon. Not because of a trophy, not because of a victory, but because of a humiliation many believed he never truly forgave. Of all the people at Wembley that afternoon, nobody had more pride on the line than Sir Alf Ramsey. Less than a year earlier, he had led England to the World Cup. He was no longer just a manager. He was a national figure, the man who had taken England to the summit of football. That was why what happened against Scotland hurt so much. England did not simply lose, they were embarrassed, and at the centre of it stood Jim Baxter. Years later, Baxter would remember the afternoon very differently from the men in the England camp. "We'd just decided to enjoy ourselves." That was how Baxter described it. Enjoy ourselves. For Scotland, it was joy. For England, it was humiliation. As the match slipped away, Baxter began playing with a freedom that shocked Wembley. The famous keepie-uppies became the symbol of the afternoon, not because they changed the result, but because they challenged England's pride. Years later, one claim continued to follow the story, that Sir Alf Ramsey reportedly never forgave Jim Baxter for what happened that day. Whether spoken publicly or whispered privately, the story survived for decades, and there was a reason for that. People could believe it, because Ramsey had spent years building England into world champions. Then along came Jim Baxter, and in 90 minutes, he gave football one of its most famous images, a Scottish midfielder smiling, and England's champions suffering. When Ramsey died in 1999, he remained one of the greatest managers the game had ever seen. But even then, the shadow of Wembley, 1967, had never completely disappeared, and Ramsey was only the first man on this list. The next football legend did not have to watch Baxter from the touchline. He had to face him, and Jim Baxter made sure he never forgot it. Alan Ball was exactly the type of player Jim Baxter loved playing against. Passionate, competitive, and impossible to ignore. The England midfielder had helped his country win the World Cup. He never backed down from a challenge. That was why Baxter targeted him. Before the match, Scotland's players joked about Ball's high-pitched voice. They compared him to the comedian Jimmy Clitheroe, the famous Clitheroe Kid. Then Baxter walked over. First came the congratulations for winning the World Cup. Then came the punchline, the Clitheroe Kid. Years later, Baxter still remembered the reaction. He went bloody spare. That was exactly what Baxter wanted. Because this was never just about football, it was psychological. As the game unfolded, Ball grew frustrated. Baxter grew more relaxed. The more England struggled, the more confident the Scot became. That was Baxter's greatest gift. He could make opponents stop thinking about the game and start thinking about him. And once that happened, he had already won half the battle. For Scotland, it was funny. For Alan Ball, it was humiliating. Years later, people still remembered the incident because it perfectly captured who Jim Baxter was: a genius, a showman, and a man who knew exactly how to get inside an opponent's head. The next football legend believed players like Baxter could be stopped. He was about to discover otherwise. Few players were feared more than Nobby Stiles. England trusted him with the toughest jobs. When a dangerous player appeared, Stiles was usually the answer. He had frustrated great players before, and he had helped England become world champions. That was why Wembley felt so cruel, because on the biggest afternoon of Jim Baxter's career, there was nothing Stiles could do. Not because he stopped trying, because Baxter was playing a different game. As Scotland moved closer to victory, England's frustration grew, and Baxter could feel it. The famous keepie-uppies were not just showmanship, they were a message that England's champions could not stop him. For Nobby Stiles, that was the real humiliation. He was the man England depended on when things became difficult. Yet the image football remembers is not Stiles winning a battle, it is Baxter enjoying himself. Years later, that remained the tragedy of Wembley. One of England's toughest competitors was there. One of England's greatest teams was there. Yet the afternoon belonged to one Scottish midfielder, and nobody could take it back. That is why the match survived. That is why the story survived. And that is why Jim Baxter remained impossible to forget. The next football legend knew that feeling better than anyone, because unlike Stiles, he actually scored that afternoon. Yet even that could not save him from Baxter's shadow. As the match entered its final minutes, England were desperate. The world champions were losing, Wembley was stunned, and time was running out. Then came a response. Jack Charlton found space and threaded the ball into the right-hand corner of the Scottish net. For a moment, England had hope. For a moment, it felt as if the story might change, but it never did. That is the tragedy of Jack Charlton's role in this match. He scored, yet few people remember the goal. They remember Jim Baxter. They remember the keepie-uppies. They remember England's humiliation, and that is what made the afternoon so painful for the men involved. Football is supposed to remember the goal scorers. Instead, history remembered the man who embarrassed the world champions. Charlton was one of England's toughest competitors, a World Cup winner, a leader, a man who spent his career fighting for every result. Yet even he could not stop Wembley from becoming Jim Baxter's stage. Years later, whenever the match was discussed, the same images returned. Not Charlton's goal, not England's fight back, but Baxter smiling as Scotland moved closer to one of its greatest victories. When Jack Charlton passed away in 2020, he left behind a remarkable football legacy. World Cup winner, Leeds United icon, one of the most respected figures in British football. But like the other men on this list, part of his football story would always lead back to one afternoon in 1967, an afternoon he could never replay, and one that Jim Baxter never allowed football to forget. But while those four legends carried the memory of Wembley for decades, Jim Baxter was carrying something far more dangerous, the beginning of his own downfall. For a moment, it looked as if Jim Baxter would live forever. Not in life, in football. He had everything: talent, fame, trophies, and a place among Scotland's greatest players. But the years after Wembley brought decline. The same freedom that made him brilliant on the pitch hurt him away from it. Drinking, gambling, and a lifestyle that slowly caught up with him. His influence faded, the magic appeared less often, and by the age of 31, his career was over. For a player of his talent, it felt far too soon. Then came the health problems. Years of heavy drinking damaged his body, Liver transplants followed, and in 2001, Jim Baxter died from pancreatic cancer at the age of 61. Football lost a genius. George Best called him a genius. Dennis Law called him one of the finest passers he had ever seen. And even today, many still wonder how much more he could have achieved. Yet despite everything that happened afterwards, one image survived. Jim Baxter at Wembley, smiling, playing without fear, creating a football memory that outlived everyone involved. And long after Baxter was gone, that memory refused to die. Football has a strange way of deciding what survives. Thousands of matches are forgotten. Thousands of goals disappear. Even great careers can slowly fade from memory. Yet some afternoons refuse to die. Wembley 1967 was one of them. Sir Alf Ramsey carried the burden of seeing his world champions humbled. Alan Ball carried the memory of the man who got inside his head before the battle had even begun. Nobby Stiles watched a footballer he could not control turn England's frustration into entertainment. Jack Charlton scored that afternoon. Yet even his goal could not change what football chose to remember. Different men, different lives. One memory, Jim Baxter. The truth is that Baxter did not destroy their careers. He did not take away their trophies. He did not erase their achievements. Ramsey remained a World Cup winning manager. Ball remained one of England's greatest midfielders. Stiles remained a World Cup winner and European champion. Charlton remained a football giant. But for all of them, there was one moment they could never rewrite. One afternoon, when the script belonged to somebody else. That is the real reason Jim Baxter still matters. Not because he won more trophies than everyone else. Not because he scored more goals than everyone else. But because he created a football memory powerful enough to survive generations. A memory that followed 4 football legends for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that is the greatest compliment any footballer can receive. Long after the men are gone, long after the stadium falls silent, and long after the final whistle fades into history, people are still talking about Jim Baxter. Subscribe, because football never forgets true genius, especially the kind that leaves a mark on legends.